Thank you everyone for making to this webinar. Yeah, cool. So let's start. So before I jump in, what this webinar will actually cover is about the documentation workflow. And then once we have covered that, we will move into how do you actually optimize that? How do you ensure that you continuously go and optimize those documentation workflow for maximum business impact? So that's we will cover, and then also cover with some tips and tricks before we close off. So let's begin. So interestingly, the documentation process, sometimes referred as a documentation workflow. The nature of the documentation workflow is it's highly iterative in nature, because as a content writers, we produce a lot of technical documentation, we also gather a lot of information from various stakeholders for creating a corporate knowledge repository and things like that. So the way in which this whole process actually works, it's highly iterative. The reason is, once you produce some content, it has to be verified by a subject matter expert or any other stakeholders who got more, who is the approval authority for that information, to ensure that that content is actually trustworthy, and more importantly, it's actually technically accurate as well. So to do that, it's iterative it's an iterative process. You draft the content, again, it goes through checks and balance in your organization, then comes back for a few reviews, and then again you have to redo your content. So that's the nature of the documentation process itself. It's highly iterative in nature. And the other key challenge, one of the key challenges with this documentation process, if you're a solo writer, you are stuck in this endless loop of how many revisions I have to go through, and it gets stuck in a bit of a process. There is nobody in the team to actually verify some of the things you have already written. So in terms of quality assurance, so there's a lot of problems with this. If you are the only tech writer in the organization, and you are a bit of an outlier in this whole organization because you are the ones who's actually producing the content, there's no support system for you, and more importantly, to get that kind of a workflow authorized and approved, you need a bit of a governance, and also you need a little bit of a managerial assistance from your manager to ensure that is formalized. Again, if you're a small company, that's where most of the technical writers are actually alone in the journey. So that's a bit of a challenge. So in this webinar, we'll uncover how do we actually solve that problem. And the third kind of thing in the workflow process is, most of the time there is no generic kind of framework that oversees this documentation workflow. People sometimes create workflows, but there is no kind of overarching framework, because of which it loses that principles in which you can actually drive this kind of which you can actually drive these workflows. Because of all this difficult challenges, and because of this iterative nature of the process, and if you're a sole writer, then it's again another added challenge. And if there's no framework added to that, and what it actually leads to is chaos. So it's chaos everywhere. I'm pretty sure most of you have experienced that. What does chaos leads to? Chaos leads to delay in delivery. You can't deliver things on time, and it also compromise the content quality, because if the deadlines are very short, then sometimes you compromise on the quality just to meet some quick deadlines. And obviously, at the end of the day, it leads to customer frustration. This would be reflected in your NPS survey from your customers, and it also impacts the bottom line. If your documentation is not trustworthy and your customer is not using it, obviously they lose trust on the product itself. What kind of product is this? Why is the documentation so bad? So to solve that, before you document your workflows, focus on putting an overarching documentation framework, and it should start with some good principles. To name a few, in our organization, the first principle for the technical writers as a part of the framework is, we say that the documentation should be inclusive. So and it also has to promote harmony in the organization, in the society. So that's the first fundamental principle in which we derive all the documentation workflow and other components of the framework. So that's a good principle to follow. And the other could be in terms of ensuring that the content quality meets your customer expectations. So that's another good principle to follow as well. So in this modern DNA age, the customer obsession has become not only just the value for few organizations, it is becoming a universal value for all the organization across the globe. So to start with, the customer obsession can only be met if it's resonating across the business, and documentation is one of the key aspect that needs to be looked into. So to put a framework, start with good principles and look at what kind of components that this framework should have. Sometimes the workflow is one of the components. The other components could be your style guides, your standards, and it could be other kind of artifacts that you need to produce as well. So start with that, and part of that is where you work on your workflow, your business process, on how you document things and take it forward for approval, and at the end it gets published. So to derive this, I want to take you back to this one of these approaches which is very prevalent in business analyst community. If you go to any kind of project managers and in there you talk to a business analyst, they are well versed with this technique of mapping all this process. It's called BPM, business process modeling. It's very effective methodology approach in terms of documenting your workflows. The way the business process modeling works is it creates something called swim lanes, where you can allocate a set of activities, tasks to a particular stakeholders. So that's what the swim lanes is. And as you probably know, the swim lanes actually create a bit of a boundary, correct? The name itself resonates that a swimmer, one cannot come in and swim in another lane, okay? So it's a very focused kind of activity that has to be carried out by a particular stakeholder, and they have to be well within their boundary. So that's what the swim lane is. And the next aspect of business process modeling is something called RACI matrix, which stands for, RACI is an acronym, and it stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. Because you're working in this business process where there are like multiple stakeholders from your business will be informed. So if a lot of people are involved, you have to segregate their roles and responsibilities. So that's exactly where this RACI matrix comes in. It gives you a 100% clarity to all your stakeholders, what role they actually play in your documentation workflow. And more importantly, it also gives you a clear communication channel. So if somebody is doing, who is responsible for informing someone, who is responsible for consulting with someone, that is all charted in this RACI matrix. So to summarize, if you want to start with the documentation workflow, start from learning some concept about business process modeling, and there are two concepts, swim lanes and RACI matrix. Let's delve into what do you mean by a swim lane. Some of the notations in business process modeling. So this business process modeling is a highly visual kind of a tool, and I will show you some of the examples that we have in our organization. So in terms of business process modeling, if you put some kind of a rectangular box, it actually denotes it's an activity. It's an activity that needs to be carried out. And if it has a kind of a diamond shape, it's something called a gateway. So it's like a checkpoint where it has to wait for some kind of approval or some kind of a or input from other stakeholders, so it can actually move. So in the gateway, you can actually branch out. Okay, if it's based on the approval, if it's yes or no, what do you do? What kind of activities you do? And events are denoted by a circle. So it could be a start event, stop event, or it could be a break event and things like that. And the swim lane is usually a long rectangular bar, and it has some a line parallel to the left, and that's where you denote who the stakeholders are. And usually a message flow is denoted by an arrow. Sometimes the arrow can be dotted, where sometimes there are some asynchronous information flow also happens. So this is some of the common kind of a business process modeling blocks that I've actually shown. You can actually use it in actually mapping out some of your documentation workflow. And there's plethora of other things on your business process modeling. If you Google it, sure, you will find a lot of notations as well. So coming to the RACI matrix, this is what I really love about bringing a business analyst into documentation workflow. The reason is this RACI matrix is an amazing kind of a technique to ensure clarity in all the activities you do. So R in the RACI matrix stands for responsible. So responsible for doing an activity. If a stakeholder is assigned a responsible role, which means they are the ones who's actually doing that activity or taking that sequence of steps and things like that. If a stakeholder is marked as A, which stands for accountability, if you're accountable, which means you are actually driving the outcome. It could be your manager, where he's accountable for such a delivery, but maybe you are the ones who are actually doing the work. So A stands for accountable, whose main job is to making sure driving an initiative for achieving a particular outcome. C stands for consulted. So who are the stakeholders who get consulted in this whole documentation workflow? So that's for C. And I is informed. Who are the people I need to inform once I finish an activity or once I'm in the middle of an activity? So this RACI matrix plays a powerful kind of a picture in ensuring that your stakeholders are on the same page all the time. So I'll just give you a bit of a typical process we have in our organization. So usually we are a SaaS product company, and usually a technical writer will get a KT from developer who is building a kind of a feature, and what the technical writer role is they draft the content. For example, it's about a particular product feature, they go and draft the content. So it involves taking some screenshot, ensuring they're picking up right kind of business glossary, and also drafting the content. And then it gets peer reviewed by some technical writer in the team, or it could be somebody else who will obviously give a lot of feedback, and based on that, a technical writer usually revises the content before even makes it to the next stage. Okay, and again, you can actually see it's already an iterative process. Even though it's a linear kind of a sequential process, you can see it's already an iterative process. Then it goes for an editorial review, where the editor usually checks for a language, a context, making sure that the right kind of business glossary is actually being used. It's not creating a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot of clarity in the content, and whatever the intent of that audience is actually satisfied using that particular documentation. Okay, so that's what they look for. And if there's any changes, again, they flick it back to the technical writer, who again have to fix those things and also address a lot of editorial and then the peer review comments as well. And then again, it actually comes through the same process again. And then in the publication ready, we do a lot of SEO to ensure that the content is discoverable and things like that. And after that, it gets published, and that's when it gets delivered to the customer. And from there also, you get the feedback. Correct? The audience is what the content is meant for, and they also give feedback through some channels. And then it comes to the technical writer. Then again, the whole process kind of goes again. So if you look at it, the point I'm trying to give you is, even though it's linear, it's very iterative in nature. And I'm pretty sure based on the business and domain you are in, it probably the iterative process as well. So just to translate what I have in terms of blocks, to putting into this business modeling perspective, and what I've actually done here is, you can actually see that there is about 4 kind of swim lanes. So this is the first swim lane, second, third, and fourth. And for the first swim lane, I put the stakeholder as content writer, the technical writer. Second one is the documentation editor, support team, and the QA team. Depending upon your business, you might have more stakeholders or less stakeholders. Okay, and then what I've done in this BPM is I've actually mapped out. So usually the content writer, they start with an activity, initial draft of release notes, and they receive a KT from a QA. Yeah, they also receive a KT from the QA team, who is giving the KT. The QA team is actually giving the KT. Okay, the support team, documentation editor, and the technical writer, they receive the KT. Okay, and after that, what does the content writer do? After this step, they go and refine the draft, and then you see that gateway. Okay, so once they refine the draft, the QA team has to check for technical accuracy. So if it's S, then it goes through this path. It goes to the support team. Again, they check for the accuracy as well. And then again, if they say yes, then the draft is ready for publication. When it comes to the documentation editor, they do the final review. And if it's yes, then it goes to the publication. What I have not shown here is if it's no, if the technical accuracy is no, if it's rejected by either the support team or the QA team, probably it'll go back to the content writer. Then the whole process kickstarts again. Okay, that's the nature of the process. I've actually marked a couple of things for you to know. This is what is the Streamline is, and activity and gateway. The easy way to produce these kind of processes, if you got a Visio license, you can do that. There are other tools like draw.io or Lucidcharts. Some of the open source tools also support this modeling of business process. So those are the tools you can actually use. So once you have done this process, again, how do you do this kind of process? So the best way to document this process is to pull all the stakeholders in the agency, in your organization, in your company, and then have a bit of a workshop where you actually document, hey, what's the process to prepare and release a release notes for product documentation? How do I do feature documentation? What is the documentation workflow for documentation team to collaborate with your support team? What's the role of your product managers in the whole product documentation thing? For each of those things, you let the stakeholders talk, then you document, and then once you document that, start with this kind of visual flow chart, and then after that you can actually change it to this based on what kind of roles the stakeholders play. Okay, it's a very important step. It's a consultation process with all the stakeholders involved. It's collaborative in nature, and more importantly, if you do that, you get the buy-in from all your stakeholders, which is very important, and you also get the clarity. Okay, once you do that, it's very important. Then you come to this RACI matrix. For example, who is based on the role. Usually on the top column you have all the roles that's been placed, and if you're interested you can also put the names as well. For example, technical writer, you can actually add the name to that role, who's actually doing that. And in terms of the left hand side, what kind of activity that each role actually play. And let me give you a quick example. If you look at reporting, who is the documentation manager is the one who is accountable for reporting, so they should drive that activity. Who is actually doing the work? It's technical writers. By the way, who needs to be informed about these reports? Is product managers and the customer support. Okay, so it's very crucial. It also can be developed in collaboration with all your stakeholders to ensure that they're doing the right kind of things. And it is the responsible of an accountable person in this whole RACI matrix to drive everything. Okay, they also need to make sure that all the process are being followed, the right kind of communication channel is established. If you need to templatize any of these things, they should drive all those initiatives. Okay, once you have done that, as I said, the workflow mapping, it starts with the stakeholder consultation, ensuring that you talk to various stakeholders and get the buy-in, and also document that whole workflow. The other important thing we need to consider here is you need to understand the current state and the future state. Most of the organization I've been part of, they actually start and then map out the current stage, and then they just blindly follow that. As a technical writer, you need to question each of those choke points, or whether that activity is necessary, whether that gateway is necessary. Okay, then you actually work out and map out the future process. Sometimes some of the activities could be unnecessary, or probably like it's actually adding a lot of admin overhead, or you're doing a lot of reporting which could be automated. So once you've mapped out your current process, if you can, then you can also look at the future state. Then you can also get the buy-in from your stakeholders as well, in terms of, hey, this is my current state, I also proposing this future state as well. Okay, so that's very important. The third kind of a category in which you have to look at the workflow mapping is in terms of the measurements. Look at your whole workflow and then find out where you need to add measurements, what kind of data you need to capture during this whole workflow process. There are many other reasons where this could fall out as well. So what you need is a governance. Ensure that you have some kind of a governance committee set up or council set up to oversee all your documentation. Make sure you involve key decision makers. For example, it could be your chief product officer or your product managers or your chief technical officer or the CEO himself. They should be the chair of that governance committee to oversee all these aspects of the documentation workflow, including the frameworks as well. Very crucial. As I touched upon the workflow measurements that comes to this data, there is two aspects as a while you are actually trying to document the workflow. One is called time to value, and you probably know that from your experience in shopping in Amazon, because they actually focus on this time to value so much, so you can get your goods delivered within 2 hours of time. So they shorten the time to value, okay, and it's very extremely crucial for a documentation as well. So the lesser time you take to respond to your customer request and you get the accurate information to them in a short span of time, you're keenly observed as one who's focused on customer. Okay, so that's one of the focus on time to value. And more importantly, focus on content quality. Sometimes we compromise quality in terms of meeting the deadlines. It shouldn't be. They should be optimized based on the business you are in. So in terms of measuring some of those the documentation workflow, the literature in the business process modeling says that you have to measure 3 things. One is time, quality, and also the resources. Okay, in each of those sequence of steps that you do in your documentation workflow, you need to capture that. Once you've captured that, then you actually derive some metrics. For example, how long does it take from me to starting a draft and getting it to the publication? Okay, or it could be as granular as possible based on the kind of documentation workflow that you have. What this process metrics allows you to do is it enables you to identify process bottlenecks. Where are things stuck? What do I need to do with it? Okay, now if you do a lot more things and you quantify that, then you actually go to your decision makers or to your governance council and say that, you know what, this process, documentation workflow process, what we have now is not working, because, and you can actually show data as an evidence to prove that. And because of that, you can also explain what kind of business impact that it has. Maybe it's leading to a lower NPS score, or the customer satisfaction is going down based on the survey question that you put for documentation, things like that. So it also helps us to identify the risks, the documentation risks as well. To give you another example on this, so any of the gateway point you have, it's one of the best practices in the business process modeling. Any gateway point you have, usually you put a timestamp. Okay, how long it starts from start to that particular gateway. So you take a timestamp on each of the activities, then you calculate some metrics, either to calculate how long it takes to move from one stage to the next stage. Okay, so very crucial metrics in terms of time as well. The more key important factor is, I talked about time to value. So you measure how long it takes from the first step in your documentation workflow to the last step. That also gives you a kind of an idea about what's your time to value as well. So in terms of workflow analytics, what kind of workflow analytics that I should develop? So time taken at each granular step. Again, I go back to this example for each of this gateway, how long it's taking, and also for the whole from the start to the end. Very important metric. The other thing is missed deadlines. So any of those process, you probably need to add deadlines so that your stakeholders are aware of that, and also they ensure completion of their review process or any kind of process they have to do. If any of those deadlines are missed, you also need to capture that as part of your analytics, because that also gives you identifying the bottlenecks. Where am I stuck? Then resource capacity. How long and what kind of efforts are actually required in each of those granular steps helps to quantify, and also it also helps to with identifying some kind of a business continuity as well. For example, if a product manager is the one who's responsible for approving it, and during the software release process, if it's getting choked by a lot of other things, probably you might deprioritize the documentation. If it happening continuously, probably you need to look at, is there any kind of backup you can actually bring in? probably hire an additional resource or things like that. It also helps with capacity planning as well. And the final piece is what I'm talking about. This documentation workflow so far is a lot more internal in nature. You only work with stakeholders. What you also need is this customer feedback. For one of the articles that you have published, how many dislikes and likes I've got, how many feedback I've got, so that I can actually improvise the content. Extremely crucial factor to ensure that your workflow is in order. Okay, all these 4 things, if you capture and do it rightly, it helps to optimize your documentation workflow over a period of time. Again, I'm talking about leveraging data. So each of the steps in your documentation workflow, you can actually create some kind of a stage. Okay, so this is a peer review stage. Next is your project manager approval stage, or it could be your marketing team approval or editorial review and things like that. Try to do that. It also gives you a bit of a Kanban board where things are with your documentation workflow, and automate all the workflow process. Once everything is set, the software tool that you're using should be able to automate all your workflow. For example, if I move it from a status from a draft to a peer review, it should go to somebody and then notify them in some of the collaborative channel they've got, and then initiate the next process. Okay, it should be done automatically. Try to automate as much as of the workflow process. Utilize the technology tools. In fact, documentation workflow, if you look at from the project management perspective, it's all about managing activities. So try to utilize a lot of this project management capabilities, and make use of analytics as well. In terms of the tech stack, I would suggest to ensure that the documentation workflow can happen. So the bottom thing that you should focus on is the project management. Focus on workflow automation, then focus on your knowledge base, then there is a feedback. This is usually the kind of tech stack that you need to have to ensure you document your workflow, implement all the things in a software tool, automate end-to-end, and also working on improving your process continuously. So this is kind of a typical kind of a tech stack that you need to have. And more importantly, all right, I'll just give you a bit of a live demo on this. So for example, this is one of the greatest tool in the knowledge base. It's called Document 360. Right now, I'm just going to create an article. Let me copy some of the content. So I'm going to create an article. This is for a demo. Create an article. So this is an article I've just assumed that I've actually drafted. So before you do that, you need to design your workflow, okay, for which we have something called workflow designer. So when you start, you can actually start with the draft, and then you can actually add all this state. I'm assuming that the next is peer review. I can actually add that. Then after peer review, my next process is manager approval. Okay, you can actually add n number of states. Think of this as like your states in your Kanban board. As you move, so from working to complete or in review or bugs and things like that. These are the 4 states that your article, your document will go through. First, it'll start in the draft stage. It'll go to the peer review and manager approval, and then gets published. Okay. Having said that, you can, using this tool, you can actually drag and drop any kind of process, so you can actually assign. So let me go back. Sorry, I'll just make sure peer review is the second process in this workflow. So once you've designed your workflow, then I go into the kind of article which I've kind of authored just now. So here you can actually see the workflow status is in draft stage. Now I click down this drop down, and I can actually say, now I want to move this workflow status from draft to a peer review. Okay, I click on that, and then I want to assign a owner for this. Okay, so let me assign it to Megan Kelly. And then more importantly, I can also set due dates for Megan to come back to me. Okay, so I'm just setting, you know what, I'm going to give you just a day. And I can also say, hey Megan, please review this article. Okay, and I set the status. That's it. So now Megan will get an email or notified through some collaboration if the notifications are being configured, and she will go and she will probably like through the peer review, and then she will come here and also set the status to the next status, probably manager's approval, and she can also pick the managers and assign it, and then after that, once the manager is approved, you can also click publish, and voila, it gets published. We also have something called workflow assignments, where it actually gives you what kind of articles you've been assigned to. Okay, to give you an example, once I click on that, it tells me there is 4 workflow status you have configured: draft, peer review, manager approval, and published. There is 60 things that is in the published state. 1 is in the peer review. Assuming there's 0 in the approval, but as you move through different stages, it also gives you that. But once you click on that, it also sorts you based on which one is with what, with who. Okay, and if it's assigned to me, it will probably open up here. When I click on it, also gives you the list of articles where I need to take a peer review or do something on the workflow process. And if something is overdue, you can actually click overdue, and it gives you all the articles which you missed the deadlines for. Probably those are your high critical articles that you need to listen to. Okay, it's extremely important for that. The other kind of thing that's very important is this feedback manager. As I talked about, getting the customer feedback. If a customer leaves a feedback, it usually ends up here. Okay, then I can actually look at a feedback, and then I can actually assign it to someone. Again, I'll assign it to Tom, and I'll also set the status as well, like planned, in progress, or complete. I'm pretty sure you will have some kind of a project management tool to manage this as well, but in document 3C it comes out of the box. And once you've done that, you can also say closed as well. You can reply to some of these things as well, in terms of putting some comments and closing it as well. Very crucial for a documentation technical writer to actually respond to the customer feedback as well. So just coming back to this tips, review your documentation process, okay, continuously. So it's very important. Every quarter you review and you optimize. The main question you need to ask is, hey, is this activity important? Why am I doing this activity? Do I need this gateway? Why is there so many approvals I need to go through before I publish my documentation? So it's extremely important. So you review this process as part of your governance. Next thing is focus on customer outcomes. As I said, you need to focus on time to value and also on the content quality, ensuring the purpose is actually met in helping delivering some of the customer outcomes. This is a great kind of a business impact that as a technical writer you have on the business. And again, as part of your review process, again, consult with all the stakeholders who's part of this whole thing. Automate as much as possible. If there's any kind of repetitive work, try to automate. You shouldn't be doing any kind of admin overheads, collecting data, a lot of checkpoints, for going through emails, nudging them. No, I believe that the technology tool should help you. If it's an overdue item, the technology tool should notify and then message them immediately that something is overdue, and as a technical writer, you're actually waiting for it to happen. In terms of automation, there's a lot of things we did internally as well, because we also prepared something called checklist. For example, if you're moving from one workflow status to another one, there is certain kind of activity that your reviewer or your editor review or your marketing team actually go through. What if they give you a checklist on what kind of things they actually check, and you do it one step before that? That'll be awesome. If your SEO team is very particular on the slug, your title, your metadata, what if a technical writer knows that and then actually does take that, do the activities before it actually ends up in the marketing team? So they know they check, and everything is just a tick box exercise. Extremely crucial. This actually builds in a lot of quality assurance in your documentation workflow. Extremely crucial. The other thing about automation is focus on high value tasks. As a technical writer, we have the freedom to write, produce content. That's the high value task. And whatever information we're conveying to the customer is actually having some kind of an impact on the business bottom line. Focus on those high value tasks. Reduce all your low value tasks. If in fact, if you can automate them, yeah, go for it. My final slide is, as a value proposition for this documentation workflow, take measurements, extremely important, and use analytics for generating a lot of these insights. If there is any bottleneck in your process, you should be able to identify using analytics. And make sure you link all this documentation workflows to a customer outcome. Talk about time to value, responding to the customer feedback. And if you tie it to your outcome, customer outcomes, the business will listen. All your product managers will listen to you. It's extremely crucial to getting things done quickly, and more importantly, showing the impact of your work as well, your effort. Thank you very much.